This is the bass guitar. To answer what it is an interesting question. I mean, if we're asking formally, it's very straightforward. It's a piece of wood with strings on it. Big whoop. But in the realms of what it is as an instrument, by its character, by its origin, by its background and its function, that's where things get weird. Keep in mind, this was an instrument that was first designed in 1951. And with 2024, that marks it just being a bit over 70 years old. And of the instruments that we know today, it's probably the one that has grown the most, technologically speaking. We went from a single pickup 1951 model P bass onto all sorts of technological advancements, from fretless basses to multi-scale basses to all sorts of these weird pickup options that exist. And with all these things going on about and seeing how differently they behave, you have to wonder, what is the bass as behavioral, at the way it behaves? Because when you think about something like piano, it's very straightforward when you see what in what ways it's put into context. If you have the classic piano sound, you can expect both classical and contemporary slash popular music with the same sound. With guitar, things get a bit wider on that regard, but mostly it remains in a similar sort of context where you know how a guitar sounds. With bass, there are many different ways that you could see it utilized by the way, by timbre. And in this way, we can find three different schools of thought with this. The first school of thought would be the Leo Fender school, where the electric bass, remove the lowest string on this one, is a translation of an acoustic bass onto an electric guitar body, with modifications made to accommodate it, making the scale length 34 inches and everything. And the biggest novelty to the instrument, which is where it got its name from, was the use of frets to distinguish where the notes were, hence the name precision bass. For the longest time, it was actually referred to as the Fender Precision, not even the bass. And so on that front, that was where a lot of the fundamental school of the instrument comes from. This is where people such as James Jamerson or Chuck Rainey were coming from when they were playing the instrument, and when they do play the instrument. Another name that could be brought up on that front is Carol Kay, but that name is it's an extensive front on its own terms. The second school of thought is when it became a bit more well known, when people began to realize, hey, people can actually use this thing as more than just, more than just a fundamental instrument. People began to think about it as not as a bass, but as bass guitar. Now, this is where two specific names come to mind, those being Stanley Clarke and Anthony Jackson. Stanley Clarke being a name to be brought up in this context because in listening to the way he talks about the instrument and the way he approaches the instrument with his playing and the influences he brings to it, a lot of it comes from guitar style. He pulls a lot of guitar techniques from it, most notably the strumming, as he does on the track School Days. That's not how it's done, but guilty as charged. Um, but yeah, it's a very novel way of playing the instrument where there's less direct translation from the acoustic bass, which was his primary instrument, of course. It really does come across has him playing the instrument as something that isn't a bass, acoustic electric bass, if that makes sense. The other person brought, and one who's more critical, less on the, not so much on the playing side as much as on the construction side, Anthony Jackson. For it wasn't he who created the five string bass, but it was he who came across the idea, who first pioneered the idea of adding the high C, the sixth string, to the instrument. His argument being that it's a bass guitar, and as a guitar family instrument, it should have six strings by default. I'm not sure about that last phrase, don't take my word on it, but the idea still stands that his belief was that the instrument should have always had six strings as a guitar instrument. This is where the two aforementioned schools of thought really come to mind here as juxtaposing Leo Fender's translation of acoustic bass, Anthony Jackson's understanding, well, the Jackson-Clark understanding as a guitar, one by playing and one by construction. So I did mention a third school, that being, in the vein of Protestantism, it's very, nah, scratch that. So with these two previous schools, we always see them in reference of another instrument. With Leo Fender, it's related to the acoustic bass. With the Jackson-Clark school, it's related to the guitar. However, there are schools of bass players, and this is a very abstract way to go about it. Well, no, an abstract thing to put into context, put into specific context. But the idea is that they take the bass guitar, the electric bass, and really see it as its own thing, separate from the acoustic bass, separate from the guitar. It's an electric bass. This is where people such as Jaco Pastorius come to mind, people like Marcus Miller, people like Gary Willis, who really see the instrument for what it is and then go in the vanguard direction with it, pushing it in its own autonomous sense. Now, I did mention too, this doesn't just apply to jazz players such as the ones that I just mentioned, but this also applies to other realms of music, metal especially. Cliff Burton, Jacob Umansky, Evan Brewer. These are players who took the electric bass and to use that as its starting point to really push what it could do further. Now, why do we talk about these schools in the first place, and not why do we need to keep these in mind? Well, going back to what's been mentioned about the technological advancements in the bass guitar in such a short span of time, these schools of thoughts have been legitimized in their own ways through the way the instruments are built. We still have vintage reissues, such as with modern vintage basses made by Robert Elric of Elric Basses, who recreate these instruments from yesteryear into contemporary contexts, like just 61 jazz basses, 51 P basses. We also have people who are pushing the instrument for what it is in the third, as in the third school, with people like Dingwall. In the realms of bass guitar, I mean that's a bit harder to quantify on the realms of builds and who did it. The only thing that comes to mind is the bass six, or people who like put who was it that made who put tremolo bridges on the electric bass. That could be seen as a guitarist thing. I'm not entirely sure, but in either case, the argument can be made that instruments in the instrument as like this has been seen in many different ways and has been realized in those many different ways. And that way and because of that, there's no one correct bass. It really depends on how you see the instrument and how you're looking to use it. There is a fourth school, and that is, I'd say that's more so where I'm coming from with the instruments, and I'm sure other people would agree. I'm sure there are more people who would look at it as such. Ooh, before I go on that front, yes, I just remembered that there are, on the realms of the guitar, like bass guitar players, there are two to come to mind: Stu Ham and Billy Sheehan. If there are people who will, like, as bass players, who really showcase the instrument as that school of thought, it's those guys. Absolutely. Now, to the fourth school. The fourth school would be seeing the instrument as something you apply other ideas to. Now, what do I mean by that is that, and like I said, this is more so my interpretation. Like, these schools are also my understanding of the bass guitar, but you know, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, of course. With this fourth school, especially really being my own paradigm on the instrument. Now, I choose not to see the instrument so much as something that has its own necessary personality, in the same way as I mentioned with guitar or piano, because those instruments have been around for centuries. This one has only in percentages of such of one. And so with the way I've been learning the instrument, both on my own terms and with professors, I've been my approach has been to apply things I learned from other instruments, other forms of music, other paradigms of thought into the instrument. So rather than thinking about trying to think what can the bass guitar sound like, as I mentioned with the third school, it's more in opposition to that and being how can I make this thing sound like other instruments? And with having guitar experience, having played guitar, classical guitar and classical piano, while in parallel playing the bass, I pull a lot from those ideas as well. Singing is singing also being another one. Each one, and I find that what that does is that it changes how the approach of the instrument from needing to make it sound like its own thing or fitting into these three schools, but it it really focuses as how to assimilate it into part of the song and making it act in a way that contributes more compositionally than part wise. Musical instrument is a very interesting term, for it somehow makes mysticism of the fact that these aren't something necessarily magical. They're instruments. An instrument is a fancy word for tool. And to me, the bass guitar is a tool. It just happens that you can make beautiful music with it.